Hi, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on today's program. Today's program is taken right out of the hypertrophy files. And the hypertrophy files are part of a series of lectures that I produced for you doctors out of the Basic Science series for Chiropractic Continuing Education. And today's program is approved for 6 hours of continuing education in the general category by the Board of Chiropractic Examiners. So welcome to the program and thanks for joining me. I hope you enjoy today's program quite a bit and that you get a lot out of it. The focus of today's program is going to be on 2 words, and these are 2 words that I tell almost every one of my patients on almost every single visit that I have with them. And these are some profound words, and you don't have to say really much more than these 2 words to your patients. And if you're able to get a head nod from your patients after you repeat this mantra to them, you'll know that you're doing the very best thing that you can for them. And this applies to you as well. Today's program is entitled Exercise Recommendations for Chiropractors and Their Patients. And so today's program is directed, first of all, doctors, at you, because I know what your life is like, and I know what it's like to be a chiropractor, because I am a chiropractor, and I've been a chiropractor for 27 years, and I know that being a chiropractor is a physical job. It's a physically demanding, it's a heavy lifting job. So we have those physical demands on us. Also, as respected healthcare authorities, we also serve as role models to our patients. So it's important that we practice what we preach. And so I direct this program first and foremost to you, doctor, and then also to your patients. And the mantra and the 2 words that I constantly reinforce both to myself and to my patients, and that I want to impart to you and your patients, is to up muscle. Up muscle. It's the philosophy of this program, and it's my sincere opinion that we need to continually focus on increasing the muscle mass content of our body, and this is regardless of age. In fact, as we age through our 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, I don't know where you lie on that spectrum, but speaking for myself, I'm probably at the midpoint of that spectrum and inching perhaps slightly past the midpoint of that spectrum. And as we do age, it becomes even more important to focus on upping the muscle mass content of our bodies. So that's the whole purpose of our program today, is to learn how to preserve muscle mass and how to promote and grow new muscle mass regardless of our age, regardless of our physical condition, or regardless of any limitations that we may think that we have that prevent us from doing just that, from building new muscle. So this is called the hypertrophy files, and this is one of several lessons in the hypertrophy files, which is a series of exercise, dietary, and lifestyle techniques designed to promote muscle hypertrophy. So today we're going to talk about lesson number 1 from the hypertrophy files. And today we're going to focus on some exercise techniques involving and focusing on 3 very narrow principles. We're going to narrow this entire concept down to 3 simple, effective, and extremely powerful techniques that you and your patients can implement right away that will tremendously improve and enhance the benefits that you get from standard exercise, whether those be performed in a health club or whether those be performed at home with simple and inexpensive implements. And those 3 simple principles that we're going to focus on in this program include, number 1, the biarticular muscles, the eccentric muscle actions, and the pre-stretch principle. And of course, we'll elaborate over the next 6 hours on these 3 principles. So if you're ready with me, I'd like you to grab your handout materials for your note-taking benefit. Grab you a snack and a drink and get ready to get down to some brass tacks of anatomy, physiology, and the science behind muscle hypertrophy. Finally, the third technique that we want to focus on, part of our big 3, and here we go, this is number 3, is the focus on the pre-stretch and the length-tension relationship of muscle. And this is going to require a little bit of explanation, so bear with me while we go through a little bit of muscle physiology here. Now, the length-tension relationship and the pre-stretch principle refer to how much force can any given muscle produce. And when it comes to consideration of the forces that muscles produce and the forces of muscle contraction, there are several variables that contribute to the absolute muscle force that any given muscle can give you. And the Essentials of Strength Training and Conditioning, second edition, describes both external variables and internal variables that contribute to the force of muscle contraction. Now, the external variables, of which there's several, and we'll go over those, include factors that are associated with the individual, meaning factors over which the individual can have some certain amount of control. And there are internal variables, which are factors associated with the internal structure of muscle, most of which you have no control or very little ability to control. So with regards to some of the external variables, and I'll just list these here very quickly because I want to set the stage for our topic, which is something that we can control, which is the length-tension relationship. Some of the external variables include whether or not your patient or your athlete or you yourself are involved in any other concurrent training going on simultaneously. So, for example, someone who's trying to get big and strong in the gym who's also concurrently swimming 2 miles a day is going to have limited results because there's just too much metabolic and physical demand as a result of additional training on top of the resistance training. External variables include diet, include stress, include the amount of sleep that the person is getting, include some of the personal habits that they may be involved with, such as smoking, drinking, taking recreational drugs, could be influenced by the time of day at which they're training. Some people seem to do better training early in the morning, while other people seem to do better while training in the evenings. And so there's all these external variables, most of which you have some control over. Then in addition to the external variables, there's also internal variables that are related more to the anatomic structure of the muscle, and that includes variations in the tendon insertion, that includes the neural control, so-called neural control, it includes the muscle cross-sectional area, it includes the arrangement of muscle fibers, and whether or not the muscles are pennated or multi-pennated. So different types of muscles have different force capacities based upon the arrangement of the muscle fibers. One of the internal variables that contributes to the force of muscle contraction is the muscle length. And then finally, an internal variable includes the type of muscle action. Now, for those of you that have the PowerPoint presentation here, I've placed asterisks next to the internal variables over which you can have any control. So for example, you have no control over the tendon insertions of your muscles. Some people have near tendon insertions, and some people have far tendon insertions. You have no control over the arrangement of the muscle fibers and whether your muscles are pennated or multipennated or unipennated. However, you do have some control over the neural control of your muscles. You do have some control over the muscle length that your muscles contract through. And you do have some control over the type of muscle action that you employ when going through your exercises. Now, neural control, we're not going to go into this at length in this program, but the neural control begins with your intention, your volitional intention. And by simply volitionally intending to lift the weight explosively, rapidly, and with maximum force can contribute to a more forceful muscle contraction than absent the willful intent to successfully complete a given exercise. The type of muscle action, we already discussed. The eccentric muscle actions are much more capable of producing forceful muscle contractions than are the concentric muscle actions, and so we're going to employ exercises that allow a heavy focus on eccentric muscle actions. And for now, I want to focus on this concept of muscle length, because the muscle length is one of the internal variables of the muscle architecture over which you can have some control through manipulation of your technique. And if you can appropriately manipulate the muscle length, you can produce more forceful muscle contractions absent such manipulation. And this brings up the concept of the length-tension relationship. So let's now focus our attention on muscle length as an internal variable that we want to focus on and command and harness as we apply technique to our exercises in order to produce more forceful muscle contractions that will then contribute to increase strength and increase muscle hypertrophy. So we know that with regards to the muscle length and muscle tension relationship, we know that the maximum contractile force that any given muscle can produce is created when the muscle is somewhere between 80 to 120% of its resting length. Now, this length between 80 and 120% of its resting length is considered to be the functional range of the muscle. When the muscle is shortened below 80% of its muscle resting length, or when it's lengthened greater than 120% of its resting length, muscle function starts to suffer. Maximum function is somewhere between 80 and 120% of its resting length. And this maximum contractile force is due to the additive contributions of both active and passive elements. The active elements being the contractile shortening units in the muscle themselves. These are the sarcomeres. And then also due to the passive or non-contractile elastic elements of the muscle, which would include the connective tissue elastic elements, which you'll recall from your anatomy and muscular system training, that includes the connective tissue around the muscle, such as the epimysium, the perimysium, and the endomysium, all of which are elastic connective tissues contributing both to the connective tissue wrappings of individual muscle fibers, individual muscle fascicles, around the muscle belly itself as the epimysium, and then also the tendinous or aponeurotic insertions of these muscles onto the bones. So we have both active and passive elements, both of which really contribute to maximum muscle force somewhere in the functional range of 120% maximum to 80% minimum of that muscle's resting length. So for those of you that have a diagram here in your handout materials or that are watching this on the PowerPoint presentation, have here for you the macroscopic and microscopic structure of muscle, and this will be a review for most of you, and we're not going to go into this in elaborate detail, but it shows a typical skeletal muscle in cross section. This might be, for example, the brachioradialis muscle, and it shows the passive non-contractile elastic elements wrapping around the muscle as the epimysium, around each of the muscle fascicles as the perimysium, and then wrapping around each of the individual muscle fibers themselves as the endomysium. Now, these elastic components, because they are elastic like rubber bands, they stretch and shorten just like rubber bands. And when this muscle is stretched between 80 and 120% of its resting length, they store potential energy. These elastic tissues store potential energy that can then be released as the tension is released from that muscle. And that potential energy contributes to the maximum force that this muscle is able to generate. In addition to those elastic or non-contractile elements, we have the contractile elements, which boil basically all the way down to the sarcomere. Now, the sarcomere is the functional contractile unit of each individual muscle fiber. And recall that muscle fibers, we call muscle fibers, these are the actual muscle cells. They're elongated cells. They're so long we call them fibers. Well, each of these muscle fibers contain organelles within the plasma membrane of this muscle fiber cell. And we call the plasma membrane of muscle cells, we call that the sarcolemma. We don't call it the plasma membrane. We call it the sarcolemma. So within the sarcolemma of each of these muscle fiber cells are hundreds or thousands of organelles known as myofibrils. Now, just like other cells, muscle cells also have other organelles as well, such as nuclei, Golgi tendon apparatus, mitochondria, and all these other organelles, but muscle fibers are unique in that they're specialized for the production of hundreds and thousands of myofibrils. And within the myofibrils are these contractile myofilaments, known as thick and thin filaments, that comprise the individual contractile units of the muscle fiber itself, and we call these a sarcomere. The sarcomere is the lowest common denominator of a single contractile unit. Now, the point of this discussion is to show you that when this muscle is stretched to somewhere between 80 and 120% of its resting length, it has the maximum functional capacity of the sarcomere due to maximum overlap of the thick and thin filaments contained within these myofibril organelles. And I don't think we need to go into a whole lot more anatomic detail. The point of it is to tell you that there's something magical about the length-tension relationship and operating these muscles within the functional range of 80 to 120% of their resting length. And this is depicted perfectly in this diagram, which compares the resting length of the sarcomere compared to the amount of tension as a percentage of maximum that contracting sarcomere is capable of generating. And as we said before, this is due to the combined additive effects of the contractile and non-contractile units within the muscle. And it shows that when the sarcomere is at 80, 90, 100, and up to 120% of its length, particularly somewhere around 110% of its resting length, it has the capacity for maximum overlap of these thick and thin filaments, and therefore greatest capacity for producing contractile force. As the sarcomere shortens and the muscle reduces significantly below its resting length, the capacity for producing force diminishes. And similarly, as the muscle becomes overstretched beyond the resting length, beyond 120% of the resting length, the capacity for producing muscle force is again diminished. And here's another diagram that shows the same thing, and I want you to focus on the middle part of the graph that shows that there is a functional range and there is an ideal range. And the ideal range is somewhere at about 100 to 110% of the resting sarcomere length. So we're going to take advantage of this principle, of this length-tension relationship, and we're going to operate our muscles so that they at least momentarily approach this 100 to 120% length compared to the resting length, and we're going to attempt to do as many of our exercises in this optimal muscle length range so that we can harness the capacity of that muscle to produce forceful muscle contractions, which will contribute to our long-term goal of muscle hypertrophy. Okay, so how do we do it? How are we going to do it? Well, we're going to start bringing together now two of our principles that we've discussed so far, and we're going to start integrating the length-tension relationship and the pre-stretch principle along with our multi-articular muscles, and start incorporating these two concepts to put together exercises that kill two birds with one stone. They involve large multi-articular muscles and large muscle masses, and also exercise those muscles through the ideal functional range of 80 to 120%, particularly focusing on the length of 100 to 120%. So we know that the length of a muscle that crosses two body joints, in other words, these multi-articular muscles that we talked about, such as the biceps, the triceps, the rectus femoris, the hamstrings, etc., the length of these muscles is affected by the angles of both joints. And this is out of the National Strength and Conditioning Association's textbook on the essentials of strength training and conditioning. They talk about the hamstring muscles. And so, for example, with regards to the hamstring muscles, due to the lengthening of the hamstring muscles when an individual bends forward at the waist, the hamstrings can generate more power, more force, than when the person stands upright, and the shape of the torque range of motion curve changes as well. So we know this to be true intuitively. We know that when we bend over at the waist, we stretch our hamstring muscles at the hip joint because the hamstring muscles cross the hip joint. And in fact, if we continue to bend forward at the waist and we continue to stretch the hamstring muscles across the hip joint, they eventually become fully stretched out to the length that requires the person to then bend their knees in order to relieve tension or stretch on the hamstring muscles. So we want to incorporate the length-tension relationship by bending over at the waist when we perform our hamstring exercises. This is one example as to how we can harness the benefit of the length-tension relationship. Well, what about another muscle? What about the calf muscles? We know that in a standing position, the gastrocnemius muscle assumes a lengthened position and can generate substantially more force than when the knee is flexed, for example, in a seated calf raise, and the gastrocnemius muscle is therefore shortened. So, in a standing position with the gastrocnemius muscle stretched across the knee joint, that pre-stretch across the knee joint lengthens the muscle, lengthens it to 100 to 120% of its resting length, thereby allowing that muscle to contract more forcefully due to the additive effect of both the contractile elements and the passive non-contractile elements, and giving us a much stronger and much more forceful muscle contraction than when the knee is bent and the gastrocnemius muscle is shortened below 80% of its resting length, thereby taking it out of its functional range. So, with regards to the hamstring muscles, and I'm going to demonstrate this to you with a couple of videos in just a moment, a study out of the Department of Health Kinesiology at the University of Arkansas demonstrated in 2009 with regards to the hamstring muscles that it's known biomechanically that flexing the hip allows for a lengthening or an eccentric contraction of the hamstring at the hip, thus allowing for a more optimal forceful concentric contraction of the hamstrings at the knee. And this is fascinating, and this gets down to our exercise selection and our exercise technique. So if our goal is to get maximum activation of the hamstring muscles, if our goal is to lift the maximum amount of weight that we can with the hamstring muscles, regardless of age, regardless of sex, regardless of physical condition, maximum is maximum. So in order to get maximum activation of the hamstrings at the knee joint, there should be more of a stretch at the hip joint in an attempt to work more optimally at the knee joint. So we would want the hips flexed at 90 degrees so that maximum force can thereby be produced at the knee joint.
Good.
So here is a series of videos that show the leg curl exercise for the activation of the hamstring muscles, and it's going to go through a sequence of progressions of this exercise that progressively activate more and more multi-articular muscle masses, and you can activate the controls at the lower portion of your screen. And what it's going to show here is, and I'll just narrate through this videotape, it shows first that this bench is set at a 30-degree flexion angle of the hips, and this stretches the hip joints across, this stretches the hamstrings across the hip joints, allowing for a greater activation of the hamstrings at the knee. So let's go through several repetitions of this exercise, and this is a much better apparatus than other benches that are simply consist of a straight or a flat bench with no flexion angle at the hips.
Yep.
Now the next progression on this exercise, which allows us to incorporate more of the multi-articular muscles and more of the pre-stretch principle, involves activation of the gastrocnemius muscles to assist the hamstrings with knee flexion. Recall that there are additional muscles besides the hamstring muscles that flex the knees. So what we've done here is we've stretched the hamstring muscles across the hip joint, thereby allowing for a greater contraction of the hamstring muscles at the knee joint. Why don't we then go ahead and do the same thing with the gastrocnemius muscle and stretch the gastrocnemius muscle across the ankle joint, thereby allowing the gastrocnemius to forcibly contract at the knee joint. Would that contribute to greater strength and greater capacity to lift greater weights in this exercise than simply performing this exercise as a uni-articular hamstring only exercise? Okay, so let's roll this videotape and you'll see the technique involved with activating the hamstring muscles. Activating the gastrocnemius muscles to assist the hamstrings with knee flexion. So let's roll the video.
Yep.
Good. Now notice the subtle dorsiflexion of the ankles. The dorsiflexion of the ankles stretches the hamstring muscle at the, stretches the gastrocnemius at the ankle joint, thereby lengthening it to approximately 110 to 120% of its resting length, thereby allowing it to contribute to a forceful contraction at the knee. And so this is a way that you adapt this exercise to get so much more benefit out of it, to exercise so much more muscle mass and to involve multiple joints in what is otherwise considered to be a uni-articular exercise.
Good.
Now in the final progression on this leg curl exercise, we're going to implement almost all of our exercise techniques. The only thing that will be lacking in this particular video demonstration is the eccentric or the accentuated eccentric component of the exercise, although that could easily be added. But what you're going to see in this videotape is we're going to start to incorporate even more of the multi-articularity of this exercise. And let me just tell you what to expect. On the last video you saw action at the ankles, action at the knees, with flexion of the knees being performed by the hamstring muscles and the gastrocnemius muscles combined. And we enhance the contraction of the hamstring muscles by putting a flexion angle in at the hip. We enhance the contraction contribution of the gastrocnemius by dorsiflexing the ankle and thereby lengthening the gastrocnemius muscles across the ankle joint. Well, now we're going to take this thing all the way to the max, and we're going to add in a hip extension component. As we know, the hamstring muscles are at the same time are hip flexor muscles and also they are knee flexor muscles, and simultaneously they are hip extensor muscles. But this exercise, the way it's conventionally done, operates or activates the hamstrings only at the knee. Well, by incorporating a hip extension, we get maximum activation of the hamstrings from origin to insertion. Add to that the contribution of the gastrocnemius muscles to assist with knee flexion, and this becomes a super effective, a very time effective, and a very hypertrophy producing exercise because of the large amounts of muscle mass that it exercises, and also because of the capacity that it has for using heavier weights than can otherwise be used in the same exercise. Okay, so let's roll the videotape.
Good.
Good. Now this begins at the ankle, goes to the knee, and then incorporates the hip. So we're getting combined knee flexion and hip extension all simultaneously, activating the hamstrings all the way from insertion at the knee to origin all the way up at the hip, meanwhile also incorporating the gastrocnemius muscle. And this is an excellent exercise and an excellent use of time. So now, in order to take advantage of all aspects of the length-tension relationship, we want to select exercises that allow us to maximally lengthen the muscle at one joint to facilitate a maximum contraction at the other joint. And you saw this in the leg curl exercise where we maximally lengthened the gastrocnemius muscle at the ankle joint in order to facilitate a maximum contraction of the gastrocnemius now at the knee joint. So this brings up a couple of concepts that I want to go into now with some length so that you have a good understanding not only of how best to position your body parts and your joints to take advantage of the length-tension relationship, but also to bring about a couple of safety issues and a couple of precautionary suggestions when it comes to incorporating these length-tension relationships into your exercise selection. So I want to introduce a couple of new terms known as passive and active insufficiency. And so we'll define these one at a time and then talk about how to incorporate exercises throughout a full range of motion, extending joints all the way from the extremes of passive insufficiency to the other extreme of active insufficiency. So passive insufficiency, we say that a muscle is passively insufficient when that muscle reaches a point where it cannot lengthen any further. It has reached a point of passive insufficiency. So a muscle becomes passively insufficient at the end of the range of motion that that particular muscle allows. So stated another way, passive insufficiency is the inability of a muscle, such as the hamstring muscle, for example, that spans two or more joints to be stretched sufficiently to allow a full range of motion in all the joints simultaneously. So let me say that again. Passive insufficiency describes the inability of a muscle that spans two or more joints to be stretched sufficiently to allow a full range of motion in all the joints simultaneously. So let's put that in action and give you an example that you can relate to. Imagine that you are bending over to try and touch your toes. And imagine you're in gym class and your instructor tells you to keep your knees straight and bend over and touch your toes. And so, being a good student, you comply with those instructions and you start to bend forward, flexing at the hip and stretching your hamstring muscles. Well, as you continue to bend forward at the hip and as you continue to stretch your hamstring muscles, there comes a point in that range of motion that the hamstring muscles reach their maximum length. They become passively insufficient, meaning that they cannot lengthen any further. So you can continue to bend forward at the waist. However, because the hamstring muscles have reached passive insufficiency, they cannot lengthen any further, and so what will happen is simultaneously as you bend forward at the waist, the knees will begin to bend, thereby putting slack in at the other end of the hamstring muscle at the knee. Because the hamstring cannot lengthen any further, it has to relax at the knee to allow additional lengthening at the hip joint. So we say that the hamstrings have become passively insufficient. Now this is important to recognize when you are at passive insufficiency, because in order to take advantage of the length-tension relationship, we want to perform our exercises throughout a range of motion that go all the way to the point of passive insufficiency. Because it's this point at passive insufficiency that the muscle is stretched to approximately 100 to 120% of its functional length. As we saw before, that's the point in the functional range that muscle is able to produce its greatest forcible contraction. Okay, so a couple more ideas on passive insufficiency. With passive insufficiency, we say we've reached a point of passive insufficiency when a full range of motion of any joint or joints that the muscle crosses is limited by that muscle's length, rather than by the arrangement of ligaments or structures of the joint itself. So again, taking our hamstring example, when full range of motion of the hip in forward bending is limited because the muscle is too short, we are unable to go to the full extent of hip flexion unless we relieve that tension or create additional length of the muscle by flexing the knee, thereby shortening the muscle at the knee. Passive insufficiency is also defined as shortness of a two-joint or multi-joint muscle, meaning that the length of the muscle is not sufficient to permit normal elongation over both joints simultaneously, such as short hamstrings. And there's several other examples of passive insufficiency that we'll go through when we demonstrate the exercises throughout the remainder of the program. But it's important to remember that we want to begin our exercises in a pre-stretch position to take advantage of the length-tension relationship, and so knowledge of where passive and active insufficiency occurs is going to be important. And we'll go over active insufficiency here in just a moment. For now, I have a demonstration for you, and this is a video demonstration that depicts passive insufficiency of the hamstring muscles. And this is a video that demonstrates the one-legged Romanian deadlift exercise. And what you're going to see here is you're going to see the subject bending forward at the hip. This is a hamstring exercise that exercises the hamstrings in hip extension. Hamstrings are both knee flexors and hip extensors, and this is an exercise that works the hamstrings at the hip by requiring hip extension. And what will happen is the subject will bend forward, 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 forward into hip flexion at such a point that the hamstring muscles can no longer elongate, and this is evidenced or manifest by a flexion of the knee. So this flexion of the knee, the point at which passive insufficiency is reached, represents the starting point of the beginning of the range of motion of the exercise. So let's roll this video here, and I'll narrate. Good. And notice how the knee goes into flexion as the hamstrings reach their maximum length because they're being maximally stretched across the hip joint. This represents passive insufficiency of the hamstrings, and it represents the starting point of the range of motion of the exercise if we are to take advantage of the length-tension relationship. And so this is a principle you want to incorporate into every exercise as applicable. Now, not all exercises are adaptable to the pre-stretch principle, but many of them are, especially those that involve the multi-articular muscles. Okay, so what about active insufficiency? Well, we say a muscle has reached a point of active insufficiency when the muscle reaches a point where it cannot shorten any further. Remember, with passive insufficiency, we said the muscle cannot lengthen any further. Well, with active insufficiency, the muscle cannot shorten any further, and a muscle becomes actively insufficient at the end of the range of motion that it produces. And I don't have a video here for you to demonstrate the active insufficiency, but imagine the seated heel raise exercise. The seated heel raise exercise. With the seated heel raise exercise, the gastrocnemius muscle is shortened or slackened across the knee joint. And therefore, because the muscle is so shortened, it cannot shorten any further, and so the gastrocnemius becomes disabled or dysfunctional at the ankle joint and cannot really contribute to ankle plantar flexion. So that explains why the seated heel raise exercise is primarily an exercise that isolates the soleus muscle, because by the very nature of that position, the gastrocnemius muscle is at a point of active sufficiency where it can no longer contribute to the range of motion that it produces. We also say that active insufficiency occurs when or it describes the inability of a muscle which spans two or more joints to exert enough tension and shorten sufficiently to cause a full range of motion in all joints at the same time. And that's again illustrated by the seated calf machine. The gastrocnemius muscle cannot exert enough tension and shorten sufficiently to cause a full range of motion at both the knee and the ankle at the same time, because the muscle is already maximally shortened across the knee joint with the flexion of the knee. Okay, again, active insufficiency happens if a muscle which crosses two or more joints produces simultaneous movement at all of the joints that it crosses. It soon reaches a length at which it can no longer generate a useful amount of force. Under these conditions, the muscle is said to be actively insufficient. So, knowing this, it becomes important when selecting your exercises to select exercises that maintain lengthening over one of the joints while simultaneously producing shortening at another joint. Otherwise, very soon, if shortening occurs across both joints, the muscle quickly becomes actively insufficient and can no longer contribute to the action that it produces. Finally, active insufficiency is the inability of two-joint or multi-joint muscles to generate an effective force when placed in a fully shortened position. The same meaning is implied by the expression, quote, "the muscle has been put on slack," unquote. And coming up, I have a videotape that shows the exercise of bicep curls, and you'll recall from our earlier discussion of the biceps brachii muscle that the function of the biceps brachii muscle is a dual function. It's both an elbow flexor and it's also a shoulder flexor. So if we want to maximally activate the bicep muscle, we want to exercise the bicep muscle throughout a range of motion that takes it from passive insufficiency, meaning a point at which it's at 100 to 120% of its resting length, all the way through to a point of active insufficiency where that muscle is less than 80% of its resting length, where it can no longer contribute to additional range of motion. And I'll narrate that when we get to that point in time. But just thinking about that exercise, how could you adapt the bicep curl exercise, first of all, to place the muscle in a position of passive insufficiency? How could you do that? How would you situate your client or yourself? Well, one way to do that is to start with the shoulder in a position of extension. Since the biceps brachii is a shoulder flexor, if we begin with the shoulder in a position of extension, that stretches the biceps brachii across the glenohumeral joint. Then if you maximally extend at the elbow, the biceps now rests at a position of approximately 120% of its resting length. It's passively insufficient, and it's ready to begin the exercise. So you would do this. One way to do it is to lean back on an incline bench that's set at a very slight incline to produce a very slight extension at the shoulder joint. Then, if you were to take that motion all the way through to active insufficiency, the exercise would consist of simultaneous elbow flexion and shoulder flexion to a point where the humerus bone lies almost parallel to the floor, in other words, almost 90 degrees of shoulder flexion, at which point the muscle becomes actively insufficient. So we've now taken this exercise through the extreme range of motion from passive insufficiency all the way through to active insufficiency. And that's one of the recurring themes that we're going to apply to the exercises that we suggest. In conclusion, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I hope you enjoyed this program. Now you have a 20-question examination that I need you to complete and either fax or email back to me. My fax number is on the top of the examination form, and just as soon as I receive your examination form, I will provide you with a certificate of completion that you can use for your Board of Chiropractors continuing education credit. For now, I want to leave you with the website for chiropractors, which is entitled EZChiropracticCEU.com. We're always coming up with new programs, so check the website frequently for new programs designed to help you succeed as a chiropractor. Again, Dr. Perry Carpenter wishing you great success. If there's ever anything I can do to help you, feel free to call. Again, thanks for being with me on this program, and best of success.